الله بالخير. قرار جزائي تأديبي صدر عن الكنيسة الأنجليكانية مطلع عام 2023 قضى بتجريده من مهامه الكنسية مدة 12 عاما، أكثر من 45 عاما في خدمة الكنيسة في بريطانيا. القس ستيفن سايزر، لماذا أقصي؟ ومن يقف خلف هذا القرار؟ هل تضطهد كنيسة إنكلترا قساوستها انصياعا لرغبات اللوبي الإسرائيلي؟ هل من دور يطلع به اليهود البريطانيون في مواجهة الصهيونية؟ من يدفع في اتجاه تمدد الذراع الصهيونية داخل الكنيسة الوطنية في بريطانيا؟ نرحب بكم ونرى ونسمع أكثر من ضيفنا الدكتور ستيفن سايزر في البعد الأقرب. هذه الميادين وأنا زينب الصفار، خليكم ويانا. Reverend Dr. Stephen Saizer, founder and director of Peacemaker Trust Charity, the priest in the Church of England banned from serving until 2030, known for his opposition to Christian Zionism, reflected in his book Christian Zionism, Roadmap to Armageddon, and author of The Right of Resistance, a Christian-Palestinian Perspective. Dr. Saizer, salam and welcome to الميادين. This is The Proximate Aspect, and I'm Zainab Al-Safar. So good to have you, sir.
It is good to be back with you.
Always. Well, before the Bishop's Disciplinary Tribunal for the Diocese of Winchester, which we just had a snapshot look at, you were penalized of prohibition from exercising any of the functions of your holy orders until December 2030. Reverend Saizer, over 45 years of Christian ministry, and here we are today. We wonder, how old will you be in December 2030? And do you consider the church penal decision against you, which bans you from clergy activities, unfair? Who was behind this decision and who opposed it?
Well, the decision is the culmination of about 20 years of harassment and criticisms, attacks on me from the Zionist lobby. So this is not surprising or new. They've targeted politicians like Jeremy Corbyn, academics like David Miller from Bristol University, and clergy like myself, in order to intimidate others from criticizing Israel's human rights policy in the Middle East. Mm-hmm. Because I've been involved in targeting and criticizing Christian Zionism, which is 10 times larger than Jewish Zionism, they've been particularly critical of me. And they've used the Church of England in order to seek to silence me. Yes, it was a disproportionate penalty. My legal team, my barrister, was expecting a year perhaps for relatively minor misdemeanors, some of which were seriously in doubt, as we can explore if you like. So it was very surprising to find a ban of 12 years, 8 to go, 4 already covered, which is virtually a lifetime ban, because I'll be nearly 80 by then, and I'll have no desire to take services on Sundays by then, I'm sure.
Right. Now, there are those, Dr. Saizer, who note and voice out that the Church of England is persecuting its priests today and besieging them perhaps to please and appease the Israeli and Zionist lobby in Britain. How far is that accurate, and who works to make anti-Semitism and the opposition to Zionism two sides of the same coin in Britain?
Well, the complaint was based on secondary sources, newspaper articles, prejudicial articles, and anonymous sources. They alleged that I'd committed acts of anti-Semitism, which were rejected, except in one instance, which had been dealt with 8 years ago. They had no witnesses coming forward to allege that I'd offended them. On my side, I had 40 witnesses. I had bishops, rabbis, Jewish academics, the descendants of Holocaust survivors, Christian, Jewish, and Muslim academics, clergy, and advocates defending me, repudiating the allegations made against me. But these were sadly largely to no avail when it came down to the decision of the tribunal. We see that as heavily weighted in favor of placating the Zionist lobby. They used a definition of anti-Semitism which has been utterly discredited. It's called the IHRA definition. You know that a definition, by definition, has to be definite. And if a definition is indefinite, it is not a definition. And the IHRA uses words like anti-Semitism may include criticism of Israel. Well, if it is may or may not, you need to use something else to define whether it is or isn't valid or not. So it's not a definition. And they used it, they've weaponized it in order to suppress criticism of Israel in particular.
Sure.
This definition was used against me.
But it's a factual fact, sir, that you have never uttered a word of hate against Jews. Yet such tribunals with no legal underpinnings, no genuine evidence or testimony conducted solely against people whose views they don't like besmirch and destroy people's lives just to prevent criticism of Israel. Has it become so easy today, Dr. Saizer, to persecute people for their religious and political views?
I think it's become common because of the use of this definition, for example, which dilutes anti-Semitism to include many things, including criticism of people who are not even Jews. That could still be considered anti-Semitism. So criticism of Christian Zionists, for example, might be deemed anti-Semitic. Jeff Halper, the Jewish academic, the founder of the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions, called it an inquisition. And he was very angry that Jews were involved in what is basically an inquisition when they suffered so badly under inquisitions led by the church centuries ago.
What is mind-boggling, Dr. Saizer, is that the Church of England is a national church linked to the monarchy. How did it get entangled in this war waged by the Zionists against the clergy who opposed them? What is the magnitude today of the Zionist influence in Britain as far as you know of, sir?
Well, the issue of anti-Semitism goes back centuries, and Britain does not have a good track record in the way that Jewish people have been treated. And when you factor in the Holocaust as well, the Shoah, when millions of Jews were exterminated by the Nazis right across Europe during the Second World War, that means that certainly within Britain and much of Europe as well, Jewish people are given the benefit of the doubt when they allege they've been marginalized, abused, discredited, or criticized. So we find Islamophobia is probably as prevalent as anti-Semitism, if not greater, because there are more Muslims in Britain than Jews. But it is understated and is largely ignored by the government, by the political parties, and by the media. So it's tragic and sad that there's a bias in favor of defending Israel, which is essentially an apartheid regime now, is born out of an attitude of supremacism. It's a settler colonial enterprise.
Expansionist policies, sure. Not a single witness, as you mentioned, said, was present in the tribunal to back up claims of anti-Semitism, and you had the overwhelming support of those who know you best. Yet, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, said, quote, "It is clear that the behavior of Stephen Saizer has undermined Christian-Jewish relations." Why on earth would the Archbishop release such a statement? Where you, I believe that your activities essentially determined the fact that they were not that detrimental to Christian-Jewish relations.
Well, I don't want to speculate as to why the Archbishop made the statement, but we know that a week before the last general election, he was prompted by a conversation with the chief rabbi to issue a statement condemning anti-Semitism within the Labour Party and particularly targeting Jeremy Corbyn. And that was so unprecedented for the leader of the church to be outspokenly critical of the leader of a political party just a few days before a general election. We know that the Church of England adopted the IHRA definition following a meeting between the chief rabbi and the Archbishop of Canterbury over a cup of tea, and it was imposed on the church as a result, we believe, of that meeting, with little or no evidence that legal advisors were consulted, and certainly the General Synod was not.
Right.
So, in my view, he issued a statement because he'd been asked to. I believe that his actions and the actions of the Church of England in its leadership have themselves harmed Jewish-Christian relations much more than I have by adopting the IHRA definition, diluting anti-Semitism, which equates Israel as a Jewish collective. And what that means is it means that Jewish people are linked to Israel, whether they like it or not.
Right.
And in so doing, they become potentially the targets of anti-Semitism.
And that's actually, that's very, yes, but that's actually the charges of anti-Semitism were brought before the Church of England by the Board of Deputies of British Jews, which describes itself as, quote, the voice of the UK Jewish community, unquote. According to the Daily Mail, it was the first time in the board's 260-year history that it filed a complaint against a church member. Is there a campaign, a witch hunt, so to say, to eliminate opponents of Zionism in Britain?
Well, certainly the consequence, and I believe the intention, was to isolate me and to intimidate others. But the irony is that for the great majority of the history of the Board of Deputies, it was anti-Zionist. And therefore, I would have, it identifies with the position I've taken historically. It was only from about the 1945, 1946, even a bit later, that there was a change of attitude within the Board of Deputies to support the Zionist movement. Whereas for most of its history, it had opposed that movement. Clearly, the Board of Deputies is not representative. We estimate perhaps 20, 30% at most of Jewish people in Britain are represented by the board. Orthodox Jews are not, anti-Zionist Jews are not. And sadly, their voices have been ignored in this whole issue of identifying what is and is not anti-Semitism, and how, whether my views and attitudes were legitimate or not.
Now, writing to the tribunal earlier in January, before it imposed its judgment, Reverend Riyah Abu al-Asal, retired Anglican bishop in Al-Quds and the Middle East, expressed his support for you, Dr. Saizer, and he said, quote, "Sadly, as a consequence of what I can only call Western appeasement, Palestinian Christians became an endangered species in the birthplace of our faith of Christianity, and the church at large in the Holy Land is close to extinction. Do you reckon, sir, that your punishment may intimidate and deter other pro-Palestine clergy from statements that offend pro-Israel Jews?
Yes, very much so. That, I'm sure, is one of the intentions. And it's tragic that the Church of England is not identifying with and advocating for the church in Palestine. Ironically, Bishop Rhea, in his letter, challenged one of the judgments of the tribunal about my visit to Lebanon, of all places.
Yes.
I was criticized by the tribunal for wearing a clerical shirt on that occasion, you know, the white collar.
Sure.
Rhea, in his letter, insisted all clergy in the Middle East must wear a clerical shirt. Otherwise, there would be an ambiguity as to what their role is and what they were doing. And therefore, he directly contradicted the tribunal, who clearly had not consulted anyone in the Middle East about the wearing of clerical shirts under their jurisdiction in the Middle East. So it's ironic that I was condemned for something that would be unprecedented in the Middle East had I done what they expected of me.
Right, I'll come back to this point, but allow me to ask you here, does the British Jewish community play a solid role in confronting Zionism today, the Israeli lobby also, and the arms inside England?
Very much so. I'm involved with the Jewish Network for Palestine, JNP. I'm a member of that. I work with the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions, ICAD. That's another Jewish organization working in Britain. We have Jews for Justice for Palestine, Jewish Voice for Peace. There are many Jewish organizations that I'm involved with and support who are in solidarity with our Palestinian brothers and sisters in seeking a just and lasting peace based on international law to resolve the military occupation of Palestine.
Yes, in reference to what you have just said about the meeting with the Hezbollah official, your meeting with Sheikh Nabil Qawuq, Hezbollah senior official in South Lebanon back in 2008, and also your defense of Palestinian leader Sheikh Raed Salah, were at the heart of your accusation by the church tribunal. Why does the BOD want to kill any apparent connection between a British priest and figures from the resistance movements? How grotesque that any criticism of Israel has become a de facto anti-Semitic stance.
Indeed, it is. And I try not to take the criticisms personally. I see this as a leaf out of the Hasbro manual, how you challenge critics. I mean, in one sense, I feel sorry for those who are trying to defend Zionism because it is indefensible. How can you defend apartheid today? Racial supremacy? It's completely indefensible, and therefore, if one sympathizes or supports that view, how do you handle critics? Well, you have to portray them as worse than you are. You have to distract people from thinking. Criticizing you to think that your opponents are worse than you are, hence criticizing me for meeting with leaders of Hezbollah, for example, I was recently accused of seeking to divert church funds to Hamas in Gaza, which is absolutely hilarious. My church leadership at the time totally repudiated the idea. When I was asked for advice on how we could support people in Gaza, I said, well, let's send some money to help one of the hospitals there, the Anglican hospital, Ali Hospital. But my critics will dream up total fiction in order to suppress criticism of Israel's policies.
Do you believe, Dr. Saizer, that one day the wall of apartheid will fall?
I believe that Zionism will come to an end, and I pray that that will be peaceful. When we look back in history, very few people predicted the fall of the Iron Curtain and communism in Eastern Europe. Very few people predicted the end of apartheid in South Africa, other than believing there would be a total bloodbath and a civil war. It came to the point where those in power recognized that they could not continue to cling to power, but they had to compromise. And so it was the internal tensions that led to the end of apartheid in South Africa and communism in Eastern Europe. And I believe what we're witnessing at the moment, with an increasingly far-right government in Israel, is leading to virtually a civil war, even within Zionism. The protests we're seeing in the streets of Tel Aviv and Jerusalem this week are not between those sympathetic to Palestine and those who are supporting the regime. It's a tension within the Israeli Zionist movement. And so I believe that we will see an end to Zionism. Justice will prevail. The arc of history bends toward justice because we believe and worship a just God who is almighty and powerful. And therefore, my commitment, along with my friends and colleagues, is to support nonviolent resistance through boycotts, divestments, and sanctions against Israel to bring about an end to the colonization and occupation of Palestine and the liberation of its people.
Dr. Saizer, how do you see the future of relations between Britain and the Islamic world with the coronation of King Charles?
Well, King Charles has a long history of respect and understanding of the faith communities. He sees himself as the defender of the faiths, plural, rather than the defender of the Church of England or the faith, the Christian faith. So I have hope. He has extensive relationships with leaders, politicians, and monarchies in the Middle East. Therefore, I am hopeful and prayerful that under his leadership, as under his predecessor, Her Majesty the Queen, we will see improved relationships with the Arab world and the Arab states, but one in which the resolution of the unjust colonization of Palestine will be central. Because at the moment, Israel's agenda is to marginalize the Palestinians and bypass them to build trade relationships with Gulf states, for example, Egypt, Jordan, and so on. We want to see international law applied to every country in the world, and that must include Israel.
Definitely, Reverend Stephen Saizer, thank you very much for sharing your views on the proximate aspects. So good to decipher your matter in depth, Dr. Saizer. Pure pleasure to have you always.
Thank you.
منذ عام 2005 برزت حاجة ملحة إلى نشر تعريف جديد لمعاداة السامية أو ما يعرف بمعاداة السامية الجديدة التي باتت مرادفاً لأي انتقاد أو هجوم على إسرائيل والصهيونية. هناك أدلة متزايدة على أن هذا كان له تأثير سلبي في حرية التعبير، ولعل هذا هو السياق الذي يجب أن ينظر فيه إلى الحملة الخمسية للقضاء على جيريمي كوربن وأنصاره. وبالمثل فإن المطاردة مستمرة ضد الأستاذ ديفيد ميلر، وكذلك النبذ المخزي لليهود الذين يدافعون عن الحقوق المشروعة لشعب فلسطين المحتلة. والأمر انطبق أيضاً على روجر ووترز وفنان الراب لوكي وعدد من الناشطين المؤيدين لفلسطين. مهما كان ثمن سيطرة إسرائيل على الغرب، فإنه بحسب المراقبين بات يشكل تآكلاً للحقوق الديمقراطية. فهل تحولت الديمقراطية البريطانية إلى وهم؟ من الميادين في مالله.